Tilea's Troubles, Part 40. Death Becomes Them. The Assault on Viadaza. Summer 2402. The ground beyond Viadaza's grey walls, out to the ancient ruins of a Morrite church by the rocky outcrops 200 yards away, was empty of all buildings, trees, walls and hedges. All had been cleared to ensure that an approaching army would find no concealment. It was a common tactic, allowing the defenders plenty of time to rain bolts and bullets upon the foe. Viadaza, however, was presently garrisoned by the undead, who rarely attempt to employ missiles of any kind, and so either the clearing had been done before the city turned, or perhaps the intention was to ensure that any attackers would spend longer looking fearfully at the foul garrison as they came on. Both round and square towers stood at the walls, and a large earthen bastion stuck with storm poles had been thrown up before the gate. Even unmanned, the earthwork would make any approach towards the gate considerably more difficult. The Morrite Holy Army, however, had brought artillery, and intended to break more than the iron-bound timber gate. Both the Pavonen and Riemann master gunners had promised their heavy shot could, given sufficient time, also bring down stone walls and towers. There were 3 guns in the army of the living. 2 were Riemann, placed among their own battalion on the right and centre of the line. Father Biagino, who had once stood in the front rank of the Viadazan pikemen as they faced the undead in battle at Pontramola, was alone, close to the artillery, very happy this time not to be in the vanguard. To the right of the guns rode the hero of Pontramola, General D'Alessio, leading the brightly armoured and prettily plumed nobility of Rimas. Beyond them, upon the flank of the line, jogged a band of skirmishing bravi. The main marching strength of Rimas was to the left of the guns, where the mob of flagellants could barely be kept in line as they moved beside the column of pike and halberdiers. Behind them the Carroccio trundled, from which jutted a huge banner bearing the arms of the Morrite Church of Rimas. Further left was Angelo da Leone's massive war contraption, in pride of place at the very centre of the line of battle, its upper deck doors already opened to reveal the multiple muzzles of the hellblaster within. Black and sooty steam belched from its long central funnel as its gears ground, rattling its frame and jolting the many crew required to operate it. The maestro himself had warned that the engine would be of very little use in an assault upon the walls, but the Arch-Lector had decided its mere presence would embolden the army, perhaps as much as the holy aura cast by the Carroccio. The left of the Crusaders' line was composed of the other 2 battalions in the Allied force, the blue and white liveried Pavonens, and the archers and grey-skinned brutes sent by the wizard Lord Niccolo of Campagrotta. Here, as well as another gun tended by its own engineer, there were handguns, bows, longbows, and brute lead belchers, all massed together and ordered to clear the walls before them of anything that moved. The young lord, Silvano Gondi, the only horseman in the Pavonen battalion, had chosen not to ride with the Riemann nobility and General D'Alessio, despite being invited to do so, for it seemed to him only proper that he should personally command his own men. His armour was practically identical to that his brother had been entombed in, for it had been fashioned in the same workshop at the same time, and, like his brother, he sported a tall feathered plume to make it easier for his soldiers to spot him, as well as ensuring they would recognise him instantly. He carried his lance couched, giving the impression not of a commander ready to issue orders to this company and that, but of a young knight about to charge headlong into combat. In truth, given even the slightest opportunity, that was exactly what he intended to do, and in so doing hoped to wash away any doubts his somewhat tender age elicited in his men. The Riemann artillery was to the right of the centre, with orders to smash away through either the gate, tower, or the walls. Father Biagino had felt compelled to join them, yet it only occurred to him later that this desire was born of the need to prove his premonitory nightmare wrong. In the dream, he had been standing upon this field with a regiment afoot, but now that he was elsewhere, then surely this proved he could thwart his dream's predictions, and thus potentially avoid the horrors they had promised. Behind the Cathaean crossbowmen between an abandoned smithy and the blue and red barded draft horses hauling the carroccio, stood the Arch-Lector of Moor, Calictus II. His only guard was his personal standard-bearer, present more to mark him out for his soldiers than to defend his person. He had declared that morning to his officers that the army was his shield, and Moor his armour. Thus it was a waste of sword arms to oblige any warriors to linger with him when Moor's holy work needed doing. In return, General D'Alessio politely suggested, therefore, that the Arch-Lector should remain at the rear, all the better to pray for Moor's blessing upon the army, without disturbance or risk of injury. Calictus, wholly aware that his priestly life had in no way equipped him for the bloody press of a melee, did not argue. Fighting Father Antonello, however, had a rather different take on things. All thought of prayer and priestly duty had gone from his head, as he gave himself up to the same frenzied fury gripping his fanatics. Leading them from the fore, he thus found himself furthest forward in the entire battle line. Not that he was aware, nor that he would care. The putrid, mindless servants of the vampire Lord Adolfo swarmed upon the city walls, peering and leering through the crenellated parapets. Gathered on the southern stretches of the wall, where Adolfo also lurked, were undead brutes, slavering ghouls, and the animated bones of warriors who had fought and died defending the city hundreds of years before. Along the northern reaches stood more skeletons, among them a necromancer, while outside the walls lurched a shambling horde of zombies, the corpses of those recently living Viadazans who had failed to flee the city when the undead took possession. The living could not know where the enemy's horse soldiers were, as the walls hid them from sight. However, those who had learned of the dwarven scout's report, and those officers who had subsequently been warned what to expect, knew they could appear at any moment, perhaps bursting through the very walls, as the scouts had personally witnessed. The height of the walls and the parapets atop them concealed most of the defenders. Only their spears and helmets, or the tops of their skulls, scalped of both hair and flesh, could be seen. None among the living could fail to see the brutes guarding the gate and the walls about it, however. Their once grey flesh had moulded into a bruised mess of blue, pierced with snapped shards of bone. One ogre's head had been hewn by a huge cleaver, so deep that even now it remained lodged, while another, atop the highest part of the gate, bore a makeshift chain flail, with threshing heads made of real heads. In the main street behind the gate, a ghastly chariot rolled along, pulled by two long-dead beasts. It carried a standard fashioned from what could only be a giant's hand, and was not only piled high with skulls, but had skulls decorating every possible fixture. The charioteer was the part fossilised corpse of a warrior so ancient it had been the fashion in his day to share one's grave with a chariot. He had been a head collector in life, and his trophies still housed the whispering slivers of the souls they once belonged to, conjoined in their ages-old misery to vent a palpable aura of foul magic cursing the ground wheresoever the chariot passed. As was proper and expected, it was Generalissimo Urbano D'Alessio who gave the command for the assault to begin, drawing his sword and sweeping it over his head to point at the walls. Drums and cornets sounded the preparative, growing more numerous and so louder as more musicians joined across the line of battle. The mules and nags in the baggage train reared and jolted in fear, not because they were unused to the beating of drums or blaring of horns, but because the field had been so quiet only moments before. When the first blast of the artillery added to the noise, for it had been agreed that before anyone moved the artillery would commence its bombardment, it was all the handlers and wagoners could do to stop the animals breaking their collars and snapping the yokes. The steam tank and the ogre lead belchers, however, had been ordered to move immediately the first signal was given, allowing both to close near enough to the walls to add their firepower to that of the big guns. Accordingly, in the very centre of the line, Master Leone's iron and timber behemoth juddered, lurched, and began to move. It managed a mere 3 yards, when it began to emit a groaning roar laced with a squealing hiss, the sound of which was unheard by most in the army due to the simultaneous thundering of the guns. Desperate to avoid calamity, Da Leone was forced to vent the steam, and immediately. As clouds of boiling vapour burst from both funnels, large and small, he knew his pride and joy would not be moving just yet. It was a rather inauspicious start to his engine's military career. Calictus II had already spotted the mob of zombies milling outside the city's northern wall. Reluctant to allow the entire right wing of the army to be distracted and weakened by the need to hack through such a stinking horde of walking corpses, he channeled prayer magic through his circlet of burning gold to make them stumble and struggle even more than usual, satisfactorily thwarting their advance. Meanwhile, the artillery's iron round shots had thumped into the walls to cause very little discernible damage. When the Campergrot and lead belchers also hefted their barrels and loosed a barrage of lead and iron, they too were surprised to see only one ghoul tumble back from the parapet. Most of their shot merely chipped tiny shards of stone from the walls. The sound of the blasts now dissipated, and the echoes rapidly diminished, to be replaced by a booming, staccato laughter emanating from the wall by the gate. It was one of the undead brutes, renowned for his bellowing voice in life, and now proving that death had not stripped him of his capability. When the horde of zombies failed to appear round the northeastern tower as intended, Lord Adolfo's lieutenant, a necromancer of considerable skill, realised some curse must have been employed against them. Undismayed, he simply decided he would raise some more. So it was that a newly animated company of corpses burst from the soil, lurched to their feet, and commenced their own stumbling advance toward the enemy. Not willing to allow his men to dwell upon the ineffectiveness of the artillery and so become disheartened, D'Alessio ordered the general advance. Praying to more, Master Leone shouted instructions down to the engineers below. Open this, release that, pull the other, and his engine of war now began to clatter along beside the huge regiment of Estalian pikemen as they marched on apace. Although Calictus's next use of the circlet was successful, an eddy in the winds of magic disturbed his concentration, and all enchantment was subsequently sapped from it. He knew it would be useless for the rest of the fight. The very same eddy proved too slippery for the lesser priest, Father Federico too. His ruby ring of ruin sent a fireball to fell 2 zombies, but then suddenly grew mundanely cold, as it too failed to preserve its magical aura. Both priests soon forgot these particular frustrations as they watched 2 round shots once again fail even to shake the walls. A third shot, sent from the Pavonen piece, did at least splinter the gate's timber. Those who noticed, which was not many, decided this might mean the guns could yet contribute to the struggle. Cathaean crossbow bolts felled 3 of the newly raised zombies, while the cloud of missiles spat out by the lead belchers and longbows threw only 2 more ghouls from the parapet. The ghouls, leering intently over the walls, their horribly bent forms twitching as their black-clawed fingers scratched at the stone, seemed not to have even noticed the deaths. Inside the city, a large company of undead horse had formed up behind the southern wall and readied themselves to ride through the very stone itself. While on the northern side of the city, a ghastly band of hex-wraiths burst from the walls to begin riding up behind the magically slowed zombies. Both the vampire, Lord Adolfo, and his necromantic second-in-command cursed as they could find insufficient winds of magic to unleash any effective spells, perhaps the result of the same eddy that had so unbalanced the enemy's priestly prayers. All they could do was watch as the enemy came on, the massed foot regiments in the centre taking the lead. Adolfo could not know, but the appearance of the hex-wraiths did have an immediate effect on the foe. Generalissimo D'Alessio and the nobility of Remus forming his guard were less than keen to ride any closer to a deadly foe they could not possibly harm. So it was they slowed their already slow pace, awaiting events to see if there was anything of use they could contribute to the fight. 3 more blasts came from the cannons, and this time one of the brace of Riemann guns blew itself apart in the process. For the 6th time, a ball of iron bounced from the northern stretch of the wall, making several of those who witnessed wonder whether there might be some enchantment upon the walls. Perhaps they had been bathed in a necromantic concoction of sacrificial blood, lending them some magical strength beyond that gifted by mere stone and mortar. Or, much more mundanely, perhaps great thick piles of earth had been thrown up behind the walls. Labour was cheap in an undead army after all. A good many among the living soldiers now began to wonder if they were marching headlong to their doom. The thought of having to climb ladders to face such a grisly and evil foe filled them with dread. Father Biagino, his cassock smouldering from the shower of sparks that had washed over him when the gun exploded, chose not to stay and see if the other gun would also shiver itself apart. and crept off to join the Cathaean crossbows. They were nearby, and, more importantly to him, were not the soldiers his nightmare had revealed. Just then, another iron shot hit the gate, and this time huge shivers of timber were seen to break away as the shot tore right through. Maybe the gate could be broken. Maybe they would charge through fully armed rather than be forced to clamber up precarious ladders with only swords and knives as weapons. Even as Master Angelo was leafing through his leather-bound notes and calculations concerning the technical intricacies of his ingenious invention, again the awful groan issued from its workings, this time punching a measuring rod to full extension, almost tearing it from its housing. Once again he was forced to haul upon both venting levers, while shouting as best he could over the shrill hiss of steam to instruct the engineers to open the fueling hatch and loosen the pressure grate. The machine slowed to a halt, and Dalione, in truth more baffled than embarrassed, now took a moment to ponder, his book opened in his palm, hoping that inspiration would strike and he could think of some way to make the machine behave. Again, the hail of missiles hurled at the walls felled only a handful of the foe, while the contrary winds of magic thwarted the workings of yet more magical artefacts. The priests came to accept that they would have to put their faith, rather appropriately, in prayer, rather than rely on enchanted trinkets and baubles. Now more undead riders appeared, trotting out of the southern walls as if it were no more difficult to do than leaping over a narrow ditch. Once they were the disciplined bodyguard of an ancient warlord, and their training seemed somehow remembered as they wheeled neatly, maintaining an almost, or perhaps entirely, unnaturally good order, and began their own leisurely canter towards the foe. Lord Adolfo found magic enough to restock his slightly damaged company of ghouls, while his necromancer glanced over to see that at last the huge mob of zombies had broken free of whatever had been slowing them. They shambled forwards, hefting rusted swords and empty blunderbusses, bent pitchforks and damp pistols, chipped spears and maces. Upon the other side of the field of battle, the soldiers of Lord Silvano's Pavonian battalion were keen on showing the Remans that they would not be laggardly in this fight. They too approached the city, their swordsmen aiming towards the gate, while the halberdiers marched straight towards the walls. Beside them, the Campergrottan ogres continued forwards, the lead-belchers leading the way, hastily loading their pieces in the hope of delivering a hellish blast at the undead riders. When they did shoot, however, only one rider fell. The noise drew the undead riders' attention. Their empty eye sockets turned toward the brutes, then they pulled at their ragged reins to turn their mounts too. In the centre of the Morrite army's line, the pikemen picked up the pace, skirting the empty earthwork and very definitely making for the gate. When it did finally break, they wanted to be ready to attack immediately. And they were in luck, for just then another Pavonian round shot smashed into the timber, this time tearing it down and felling the portcullis behind too. The way into Viadaza was now open, and apart from the self-inflicted destruction of a cannon and crew, the Morrite forces had yet to lose a single man. Upon the walls, Lord Adolfo wove adroitly through the fidgeting ghouls to find a better spot to sight the foe, from where he could cast magic to aid both his horse soldiers as well as the defenders on the walls. As the gate splintered and fell, he glared over the parapet, his red eyes exuding hatred, fangs bared, and he began to ponder whether he could hold this city, or whether it might be best to leave and return to his mistress. It seemed to him that a fight to the death meant that she would lose both Viadaza and the army, whereas if he could escape with some of his force, then only the city was lost. His loyalty to her was strong, informing his every decision, yet for now he put any thought of flight from his mind. His blood was up, and a fury knotted every muscle in his body. This city had been his in life, and was still now his in death. He would try this fight a little longer. His army was still almost wholly intact, and he would have it tear deep into the foe before he chose to yield this city. If he was to leave and flee to his mistress, he intended to tell her he had left the enemy wounded, reeling and afraid. A hail of missiles poured against the upper reaches of the southernmost walls, bringing down 3 ghouls, but the volley gun on the upper deck of the steam engine fired low, and so merely left a ragged patch of indentations in the stone. Immersed in calculations regarding the workings of his machine, Master Angelo was entirely ignorant of how badly its opening shot had fared. Now came the first charges, not delivered by the Crusaders but against them. The last two surviving zombies of the newly raised pack ran into the flagellants. One reached for Father Antonello, only to lose its outstretched arm when the priest's sword came down with furious strength. Of course, the maniacal Morrites made short work of the last zombie, and with such ease that those in and behind the third rank had no idea that any sort of fight had even occurred. The undead horse came thundering into the lead belchers, their spear tips and ancient blades finding their marks with uncanny accuracy, so that one ogre fell and the rest were blooded. In return, only one rider was dispatched, and the surviving ogres, confused by the unexpected brutality of the onslaught, turned and fled. Finding the ogre bulls immediately behind them, they faltered, a momentary lapse that allowed the riders to cut down the last of them. The riders then leapt over the twitching corpses and slammed into the bulls. Although surprised to discover the foe suddenly so near, young Lord Silvano was determined to prove to his veteran soldiers that he was worthy of not only their obedience, but also their respect. He lowered his lance, gripped tight upon his shield, and spurred his mount to charge into the skeleton riders who had just engaged the ogres. Silvano's halberdiers, still marching towards the city and wondering how in God's name they were supposed to assault a wall defended by a foe as vicious as ghouls, now had something else to worry them. They had been present when Lord Polcario, Silvano's older brother, had perished upon the walls of Trantio in the doubly fatal duel against the tyrant Prince Gerenzo. Now, here they were, as the Duke of Pavona's last surviving son, a stripling who had yet to fight any foe at all, never mind face horrors from beyond the grave, had entered a deadly combat. None of them wanted to be upon the receiving end of Duke Guidobaldo's angry grief if the lad died. Their sergeant, ashen-faced, screamed at them to wheel left. The assault would have to wait. One or two amongst the body, although they would never admit it, were actually glad of the distraction, for it could well mean that they would no longer have to climb the walls to their almost certain deaths. In the centre, the Estalian pikemen were closing upon the gate, and their captain was considering how exactly he could form the body so as to get through. In the front rank was the Morrite lector of Viadaza, Bernardo Ugolini. How strange, he thought, to be approaching the gates of his own city as an attacker. When the city's new stench came wafting through the open port, however, it was a cruel reminder of what exactly Viadaza had become, and why such a destructive cure was necessary. Glancing up, he saw an undead brute glaring down from the parapet, and so he quickly channeled Moore's stare with a holy prayer to send the foul creature toppling backwards from the wall. Aware of just how close Father Antonello's flagellants were getting to the huge mob of zombies, the Arch-Lector Calictus II began chanting the words of the prayer Moore's caress. He felt divine power flowing through him, and knew that the zombies would now be weakened. Faced with the flagellants' fury and flails, that weakness would surely mean their imminent demise. Once again, a vast volley from the living's left wing resulted in the deaths of a mere handful of foe, the sturdy stone walls proving a considerable and continuing hindrance. Not that those doing the shooting were keen to try some other form of attack. Prolonged shooting and aching arms was much preferable to close proximity to a foe at one at the same time, both undead and deadly. This time the steam engine's volley gun did fell a ghoul, and this time Master Angelo noticed. His brow furrowed as he recalled the promises he had made concerning how well his costly machine of war would function in battle. He had boasted of much more than the equivalent of a lone handgunner's lucky shot. Putting his book down, he now strode over to the volley gun and took closer command of the crew. Lord Silvano's lance lifted a skeleton rider right out of his saddle, and sent both his and his mount's shattered and parted bones tumbling. When the ogres fell two more, the shock was sufficiently strong to unweave some of the magical threads animating the ancient warriors, and cause two more riders to collapse. Over on the far side of the field, the flagellants had worked themselves into such a furious fervour that two of their own number perished in the mayhem. They cared not, and as they smashed into the horde of undead before them, they released a truly terrible torrent of iron-bound blows. Although two more flagellants were to die at the hands of the zombies, 13 zombies were fatally crushed and torn in return, when Father Antonello himself beheaded two more. So disruptive was their joint assault that 14 more zombies tumbled to the ground. Upon the wall, the monster that Lord Adolfo had become, his vampiric form made bestial by the family taint of Orcan blood in his veins, invoked dark magic to heal his riders, reknitting the mounted champion's bones back together so that in a moment he was back, sword in hand, facing the more than a little surprised Lord Silvano. This confusion threw the young lord, and as he now set about attacking the champion for the second time, all his blows failed to land. Nor was he the only one struggling, as by his side another ogre was cut down. Although some riders were felled by the remaining bulls, several for the second time, the fight remained in the balance. The watching Pavonan halberdiers now knew with sickening clarity that their young general was caught in a combat which, if the vampire Lord Adolfo employed sufficient magic, might prove ultimately deadly. So without pausing, they charged into the skeleton rider's flank. 3 more flagellants perished as a consequence of their own carelessly spiralling frenzy, while the rest hewed through the last dozen zombies, and then, even without a moment's consideration, they hurled themselves at the wall, throwing up their ladders with abandon to begin the ascent. Their only thought was to fight some more. No matter how hard he tried, Lord Silvano could not hurt the re-raised champion. It did not matter, though, because with the halberdiers and the ogres attacking all around them, the last vestiges of the magical force holding the skeleton riders in this realm began to weaken, and several riders crumbled to the ground. Surely the stubborn champion would also soon succumb. The 2 remaining Crusader cannons had begun to concentrate their fire upon the tower between the gate and the southernmost stretch of the eastern wall. Ball after ball plunged into the stone, each one now visibly weakening the structure, until it leaned precariously backwards, looking like a stiff wind would be sufficient to knock it down. The Pavonan swordsmen near it slowed their pace almost to a halt, each of them praying that it would fall soon, and so grant them a way into the city less deadly than climbing the walls. Meanwhile, the Estalian pike regiment had formed into a column of 3 and began emerging into the city proper, their battle cries echoing off the grey stone all around them. Directed by Master Angelo, the volley gun crew loaded, cranked, levered and then triggered the firelock ignition to blast once more, this time blowing apart one of the undead brutes on the parapet above the gate. The other brutes failed even to flinch at their comrades' violent demise, merely watching as more and more of the pikemen streamed through the gate below them. The Pavonan Lord Silvano Gondi was struggling to best the bony champion, distracted as he was by the need to regain control of his own terrified mount, what with ogres to one side and walking dead to its fore, and breathed a sigh of relief when the champion and the last remaining riders finally collapsed. Lord Adolfo's sustaining magic had withered away completely, for the simple reason he was not even looking their way anymore. Instead, the vampire's attention was turned to within the city, where both his and his servants' necromantic magic was pouring forth to animate and reanimate zombies, skeletons, and even the undead brutes. Itself awash with a flow of dark magic, the ancient headhunter's chariot clattered along the lane behind the walls to crash into the pikemen's flank, but it had scraped against the wall along the route, which slowed it and lessened its impact. It did little harm to the pike. When the Estalian champion then hacked a head off one of the horses pulling it, the whole thing crumbled to the ground. The earthwork before the gate was now revealed to be a grave pit, as well as a defensive feature, for zombies now clawed their way out of the soil to face the flank of the pikemen attempting to negotiate the gate. Very soon the flagellants, again at the cost of several of their own number, sacrificed to their spiralling frenzy, had cleared the wall of skeletons and moved to occupy the northeastern tower, allowing the Cathaean halberdiers to clamber up onto the wall behind them. 3 living regiments had already penetrated the city's defences. When the first Cathaeans to arrive on the parapet looked down into the city, they saw that the ethereal riders had passed back through the wall to face towards the pikemen. It was obvious that the hellish warriors intended to charge, a move which could overwhelm the pike, especially as they were now engaged to their front with the growing swarm of zombies Lord Adolfo was summoning. Fully aware of just how hard-pressed the pikemen might find themselves, assaulting through the main entrance to the city, the Lector Viadaza blessed them with Mor's holy protection and harmonic convergence. Then, as the Arch-Lector himself once again cast Mor's murderous caress upon the brute horrors, 2 more cannonballs slammed into the tower to the south of the gate and finally brought it toppling down. Outside the gate, the zombies upon the earthwork were blasted from all sides. Dwarven pistols, the Carrocchio's handguns, the steam engine swivels, and the volley gun's barrels. What twitching, broken, muddy remnants were left on the earthwork no longer presented any sort of threat. 3 staggered uncertainly towards the dwarfs, to be cut down laughably easily, although no one was laughing. As the pike began a somewhat messy fight with the zombies inside the gate, the large body of skeletons manning the currently unthreatened southern wall now trooped down into the city, heading towards the fallen tower's rubble remains. Lord Adolfo intended them to prevent anyone else entering that side of the city, hoping that thus the pikemen could be dealt with before anyone could come to their aid. The hex-rays galloped silently down the length of the lane behind the northern wall to hurtle into the flank of the pikemen, immediately killing 3 with their cursed scythes. But the pike was still hacking at the zombies in front of them, hewing umpteen apart, and in so doing they shattered the magical forces holding both the last zombies and the hex-rays in this realm. In a moment, they suddenly found themselves facing nothing but heaped corpses, with only 2 hex-rays left to their side. The other riders had dissipated into faint wisps of etheric vapours. To the south of them there was a clattering sound, as the Pavonan swordsmen came scrabbling over the tower's ruins to join the Estalians inside the city proper. There they immediately saw the skeletons pouring up the street towards them, and moments later the 2 bodies were locked in combat. The sheer weight of numbers of pikemen meant that the mounted rays failed to inflict enough damage to unnerve them, and when the last 2 also vanished from this world, the pikemen calmly reformed to face the walls to ensure the surviving brute still occupying the parapet could not surprise them from behind. With so little left to shoot at upon the walls, it did not seem important that the next bout of missile fire, everything from cannonballs to arrows, inflicted no harm at all. The Pavonan gun, its barrel fouled by the rapid firing and its crew exhausted, failed to fire at all, even with a skilled engineer tending it. The crew now took the opportunity to stop for a moment and study the walls, while their engineer peered through his long-rifled Jezzail sights, sweeping along the parapets to examine each one. He watched in fascination as the foe began to leave the walls. Lord Adolfo, realising that to continue the fight would mean certain destruction, now decided it was time to leave. And quickly. The vampire lord loosed a terrible wail as a signal. He himself had already leapt across to the southern wall, while behind him the ghouls began leaping down to scamper through the streets towards the docks. Lord Adolfo leapt down to join them, quickly outpacing all the rest as he led them away. The Cathayans on the wall sounded their horns, and the crew of the surviving Riemann gun joined in prayers with the Arch-Lector's priestly clerk standing close by, while Father Biagino and the Cathayan crossbowmen glanced over to Generalissimo D'Alessio to see if he was going to signal victory. He did, and the cheers spread from field to wall to inside the city. Viadaza was retaken. The Holy Army of Mor had gained its first victory.